Just as the Ukraine war approaches its third anniversary, a bombshell move from Donald Trump, calling Vladimir Putin to arrange talks and instructing his defense secretary to give a speech that has major implications not just for Ukraine, but also for the whole of NATO.
Now, along the Canada-U.S. border today, nobody was expecting Trump to carry out any of his threats. But at the same time, there's the suggestion that Canada might have to turn to Europe for help if any conflict develops. Al Sweeney has the story from Niagara Falls.
Well, we've been hearing it and reading it for months now. U.S. President Donald Trump repeatedly saying Canada should become the 51st state, and that's put some Canadians on edge. But not everybody is convinced.
Europe has just made a move that no one saw coming. For years, the continent relied on the United States and Russia to keep its energy flowing. But just when you thought things were stabilizing, Europe did something completely unexpected. It turned its back on the U.S. and opened its doors to Canada. And here's where things take a shocking turn. This isn't just about gas, this is about power, influence, and the shifting weight of global trade. It's about who now calls the shots.
Now, along the Canada-U.S. border today, nobody was expecting Trump to carry out any of his threats. But at the same time, there's the suggestion that Canada might have to turn to Europe for help if any conflict develops. Al Sweeney has the story from Niagara Falls.
This was the front line for the first U.S. invasion of Canada. That was about 200 years ago in the War of 1812.
We talk about, the bloodiest battle ever fought in Canadian soil happened right here in Niagara Falls at the Battle of Lundy's Lane. And there's always a good thing that comes out of bad things, and that was the recognition of we're better off as friendly neighbors than enemies.
The mayor of Niagara Falls says that was the lesson. Canada and the U.S. should work together. But the latest social media post from Donald Trump is entitled the Don Roe Doctrine, a play on the Monroe Doctrine of 18th century American expansion. It names Canada as the 51st state and renames Greenland, the Panama Canal, and the Gulf of Mexico.
For decades, the United States held a firm grip on Europe's energy supply. American liquefied natural gas, LNG, dominated the market, securing long-term contracts and keeping European industries running. But recent events have shaken that foundation, forcing European leaders to rethink their alliances. With political instability, rising trade tensions, and an increasing focus on diversifying supply chains, Europe has decided that depending on the U.S. is simply too risky. And the alternative they've chosen? Canada.
The NATO alliance has guaranteed European security for almost 80 years since 1949. And essential to all that has been America's support. Now, for the first time, that is in some doubt. NATO may have expanded, numbering 32 members now, including Sweden and Finland. But the US is still by far its most important member. America has more than 100,000 military personnel deployed in Europe, has air bases, intelligence bases, and naval assets all stationed here. Donald Trump has been pointing out for years that America spends vast amounts more on defense than any other NATO nation. As you can see here, more than all the other NATO nations put together, with the UK now falling behind Germany into third place. But when viewed as a fraction of GDP defense spending, it looks a bit different. Poland is in the lead, then Estonia, and then America, a flatter line. Now, NATO is thinking of raising its guidelines for defense spending from 2% to 3%. Now, that still leaves it well short.
At first, this shift might seem minor, just another supplier entering the market, but what happens next will change everything. Canada isn't just offering gas, it's offering something that the US and Russia can't compete with. It has been quietly upgrading its LNG infrastructure, especially on the East Coast, making it cheaper and faster to deliver gas across the Atlantic. The country also offers something that Europe desperately needs: political stability. No sudden sanctions, no tariff wars, no supply chain disruptions, just steady, reliable energy. One major consequence of this shift that few are talking about is the impact on U.S. energy jobs. For years, American LNG exports created thousands of high-paying jobs, from pipeline construction to shipping operations. But with Europe shifting its focus to Canada, demand for U.S. gas is set to decline, putting many of those jobs at risk. And other world leaders are not having it.
Well, we've been hearing it and reading it for months now. U.S. President Donald Trump repeatedly saying Canada should become the 51st state, and that's put some Canadians on edge. But not everybody is convinced Trump would follow through with annexing the U.S.'s closest ally.
I do not believe that represents a real threat to us, but those remarks are disrespectful and concerning.
Defense Minister Bill Blair telling reporters in Brussels that while Trump's comments are offensive, he does not believe Canada is actually at risk of being annexed by the U.S. And that's raising questions over what Trump's real goals are with all his 51st state talks. So to help us answer that question, we're joined by Stephen Marsh. He's the author of The Next Civil War, which, by the way, is a great piece published in Maclean's. You should have a read, but after this interview, because right now we want to talk to Stephen. This piece in Maclean's, Stephen, that you published describes Trump's comments as fantasies of annexation and conquest. Why do you believe that the U.S. cannot annex Canada?
If American energy companies lose market share, they may be forced to cut jobs, reduce investment, or shut down operations in key energy-producing states like Texas and Louisiana.
It is a regular pattern now. At the same time, most days, the cameras called into the Oval Office for an impromptu moment with the president, announced only minutes before.
And on trade, I have decided, for purposes of fairness, that I will charge a reciprocal tariff, meaning whatever countries charge the United States of America, we will charge them. No more, no less.
We knew he'd sign executive action on reciprocal tariffs.
Well, that's a good one.
What wasn't quite clear is what they would look like. But here, he spelt it out.
So a VAT tax will be viewed as a tariff. Certain areas of Europe do it, to put it mildly. They have about a 20% VAT tax. Sending merchandise, product, or anything by any other name through another country for purposes of unfairly harming America will not be accepted.
And just when you thought it couldn't get worse for the U.S., here's where things take an even wilder turn. This shift isn't just about Canada and Europe, it's about the ripple effect spreading across the entire global energy market. For years, the U.S. reaped the benefits of Europe's reliance on its gas. But now, American energy companies are facing serious competition. Europe's decision to embrace Canada has forced U.S. suppliers into a corner. Either lower prices and renegotiate contracts, or risk losing a major share of the market.
Of what Russia is spending, almost 7% of its GDP, so Putin can fight his war in Ukraine. US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says Europe must do more to secure itself, and America has other things to focus on, causing concern about America's commitment to the alliance. But it's what he says about Ukraine that's caused the most alarm in the West, even if Russia is probably delighted.
When he says that if there's a peace deal, there won't be any American involvement in keeping the peace in Ukraine, and it must not be anything to do with NATO, I think that's going to have people in Brussels, somewhat alarmed. Fundamentally, I think this kind of a line will go down extremely well in the Kremlin, because what it says is, right up front, before any negotiation, we're ready to go along with the idea that Russia can help itself to part of next door Ukraine's sovereign territory.
So even before any negotiations start, the Trump administration seems to be ceding ground to Vladimir Putin.
But here's the real kicker. It's not just the U.S. feeling the heat. Russia, which once dominated European gas markets, is watching as its influence crumbles. Ever since political tensions drove Europe to reduce dependence on Russian energy, alternative suppliers have been scrambling to fill the gap. At first, the U.S. took the lead, but now with Canada stepping in, Russia is realizing that its grip on European energy is slipping even further. And it's not just Russia. OPEC is starting to sweat too. A new LNG powerhouse like Canada doesn't just threaten oil deporting nations, it shakes up the entire structure of global energy trade.
He wants to rename the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America.
What do you think of that?
That is so stupid nonsense about it, like how the hell he's going to do that.
While Americans weren't in favor of Trump taking over Canada.
We can stay friends, that's okay.
I think he's probably taking advantage of the stepping down of Trudeau. But like you said, I think it's ideal for Canadians to kind of stand their ground and say, no, we'll handle it.
But a common theme is that with Trump, you never know.
I love Canada. As far as our president-elect, it's kind of a big 50-50. You don't know what's going to happen until it happens, right?
There's also the suggestion here that Canada may have to turn to Europe for support against the United States, with Canadians a little worried.
If we don't have the Europe behind us, it's going to be the dominoes effect, isn't it?
Europe, they are our allies too. Shouldn't they be coming to help us?
And this is where things get even crazier. Canada isn't just stopping in Europe. While its entry into the European LNG market is making headlines, the real long-term play is happening in Asia. Countries like China, Japan, and India are all looking for stable energy sources, and Canada is positioning itself as the go-to supplier. The world's second largest economy, China, is actively seeking alternatives to U.S. energy imports, and Canada is more than willing to fill that demand.
These tariffs will be on a country-by-country basis, hitting only those nations with a big trade deficit with the United States, and Britain is not one of those. But Donald Trump has not ruled out it being a blanket tariff. The problem is that countries right around the world, no exaggeration, are playing constant catch-up with every announcement that comes out of the White House, trying to decipher what it means.
Nominees to the President's Intelligence Advisory Board.
And in another free-flowing moment, he darted from tariffs to Ukraine, NATO, Putin, and a call for Russia to be brought back into the club it was expelled from.
Yes, please.
After its invasion of Crimea.
I'd love to have him back. I think it was a mistake to throw him out. Look, it's not a question of liking Russia or not liking Russia. It was the G8. And you know, I said, what are you doing? You guys, all you talk about is Russia, and they should be sitting at the table. I think Putin would love to be back.
Do you trust President Putin?
I believe that, I believe that he would like to see something happen. I trust him on this subject.
What happens next is what no one in Washington wants to admit. The U.S. is starting to lose its grip, not just in energy, but in trade dominance as a whole. For years, Washington relied on strong economic ties with its allies to maintain global influence, but now, the very countries that once depended on the U.S. are moving away. And if you think this is just about gas, just wait, because the economic consequences are only beginning.
He would like to see something happen. I trust him on this subject.
And beyond these profound shifts in trade policy and geopolitics, over the road at the presidential guest house, the visiting Indian Prime Minister had a meeting. It's not clear if Elon Musk, now White House employee, was here as a tech CEO or a government official, but his delegation was his family, and discussion, we're told, was of space, electric cars and technology. Any conflict of interest, not a concern for the president.
I assume he wants to do business in India, but India is a very hard place to do business in because of the tariffs.
Donald Trump is setting the pace right now on so many issues. Over just the next 36 hours, on Ukraine, on Gaza, and on trade globally.
This shift didn't happen overnight. It was set in motion by years of increasing U.S. protectionism. Tariffs, trade restrictions, and economic policies designed to put America first have instead pushed allies toward new partnerships. Canada, once locked into U.S. trade networks, has begun strategically reducing its reliance on American markets. Instead of looking south, it's looking east, to Europe and Asia.
Crisis averted, and there is a definite sense of relief where I am, here in Windsor, Ontario, on the Canadian side of the border. The river behind me is the Canadian-US border, and that city there is Detroit, America's motor city, and this is the Canadian equivalent. There is a huge amount of trade that travels across the bridge into the United States. Slapping a 25% tariff on all the goods that go through would have been hugely punitive for the Canadian economy. So it is a massive relief that there will be a pause in tariffs for 30 days at least.
And here's where the real danger lies for the U.S. As more countries move away from American trade dependence, the U.S. risks becoming increasingly isolated in global markets. For decades, the world's largest economies depended on American exports, American investments, and American leadership. But now, as countries like Canada, China, and the EU strengthen their trade relationships without the U.S., that dominance is starting to erode. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, here's the most shocking part. Canada's growing energy influence isn't just about natural gas. It's about reshaping global economic alliances. The EU's comprehensive economic and trade agreement, CETA, with Canada has already led to record-breaking trade numbers, reaching over $110 billion in just a few years. Meanwhile, Canada is also securing long-term energy deals with Japan and China, further solidifying its position as a global trade power.
Canada says it will work to strengthen its border to try and stop the flow of fentanyl into the United States, though to be honest, there is very little fentanyl that crosses into the United States from here. Nevertheless, that seems to be the deal that they've struck, and it seems to have worked. But there is also a fear that this is just a delaying tactic and that in 30 days' time they'll be in the same position. Friends, partners, trading partners who now feel their relationship is very much under strain.
So, what does all of this mean for the US? In short, a shrinking market share, declining global influence, and a growing struggle to stay competitive. American businesses that once dominated international markets are now watching as trade shifts away. Energy companies that relied on European customers are seeing contracts dry up. And if the US doesn't act fast, it could soon find itself sidelined in the very industries it once controlled. The warning signs are everywhere. Foreign investment in US industries is slowing, supply chains are being redirected, and longtime allies are choosing new partners. If Washington continues down its path of trade restrictions and short-term economic policies, it risks losing not just energy dominance, but its position as a global economic leader.
The things that Trump is talking about are actually going to happen, but there's uncertainty. The mayor says people shouldn't overreact to what Trump is talking about, but says Canada should sit down with him to talk about economic cooperation.
Well, we've been hearing it and reading it for months now. U.S. President Donald Trump repeatedly saying Canada should become the 51st state, and that's put some Canadians on edge. But not everybody is convinced Trump would follow through with annexing the U.S.'s closest ally.
I do not believe that represents a real threat to us, but those remarks are disrespectful and concerning.
Defense Minister Bill Blair telling reporters in Brussels that while Trump's comments are offensive, he does not believe Canada is actually at risk.
But here's the final twist. This isn't just a loss for the US economy. It's a sign that the world is changing. Canada's rise in energy exports, Europe's shift in trade policy, and Asia's growing independence from the US are all part of a larger pattern. The countries that once relied on American leadership are learning to stand on their own. And the longer the US waits to respond, the harder it will be to reclaim its influence. So now the real question is, can the US adapt before it's too late? Or will it watch as the global economy moves on without it? Whatever happens next, one thing is certain. This is only the beginning. So what are your thoughts on these issues? Let us know in the comments section. And why not smash that like and subscribe buttons for more